The restaurant looked perfect that evening. Soft golden lights reflected off polished tables, and the quiet sound of glasses touching mixed gently with low conversations. Everything felt carefully arranged, almost like a scene from a movie. People dressed in expensive clothes sat comfortably, laughing and talking as if they belonged there. And in a way, they did. She moved between them silently, carrying trays, pouring drinks, and clearing plates. No one really noticed her. She was just part of the background, like the music playing softly in the room. Her steps were light, her face calm, her eyes focused on her work. She had learned how to be invisible in places like this. It had been a long shift already, and the night was far from over. A private party had taken over the main hall, making everything busier than usual. The guests were important, or at least they acted like they were. They spoke loudly, laughed freely, and expected everything to be perfect. She didn't mind. She had gotten used to it. Still, something felt different about tonight. Maybe it was the energy in the room, or maybe it was just a feeling she couldn't explain. Every now and then, she glanced toward the grand piano placed near the center of the hall. It was beautiful, shining under the lights, almost untouched. It had been set up for the evening's entertainment. But there was a problem. The pianist hadn't arrived. At first, no one seemed too worried. The host checked their phone, spoke quietly to the manager, and tried to keep things under control. But as time passed, the tension started to grow. The music system was turned on to fill the silence, but it wasn't the same. Something was missing. Guests began to notice. A few of them asked questions. Others made small jokes about the situation. The host forced a smile, but it was clear they were frustrated. This event was meant to be perfect, and now something simple had gone wrong. She watched all of this from a distance while continuing her work. She wasn't involved, and she didn't expect to be. Then everything changed in a moment. Someone near one of the tables laughed and said, almost jokingly, "Does anyone here even know how to play?" It was meant to be a light comment, something to ease the mood. But instead, it turned into something else. Another voice spoke up, louder this time. What about her? For a second, she didn't realize they were talking about her. She kept walking, holding a tray carefully. But then she noticed a few heads turning in her direction. Her heart skipped. "Yeah, you," someone said, pointing. She stopped. The room didn't go silent, but the attention around her suddenly felt heavy. She looked confused, unsure what was happening. The host stepped closer, curious. "Do you play?" they asked. She hesitated. There was a pause that felt longer than it actually was. Her mind raced. She could feel people watching her, waiting for an answer. "A little," she said quietly. It was the truth, but not the whole truth. Some guests chuckled softly, thinking it was just a casual reply. No one really expected anything serious. The host smiled, but there was urgency behind it. "That's fine. Just something simple. We just need a bit of live music until this gets sorted." Simple. The word echoed in her mind. She looked at the piano again. It felt farther away now, even though it was only a few steps from where she stood. I haven't played in a long time," she added, her voice almost lost in the noise. "That's okay," the host replied quickly. "Really, anything will do. Anything." The pressure wasn't loud, but it was there. Gentle, polite, but impossible to ignore. She could have said no. She could have laughed it off and returned to her work. No one would have forced her. After all, she was just a waitress. But something inside her didn't let her walk away. Maybe it was the piano. Maybe it was the memory of something she had once loved. Or maybe it was the feeling that this moment mattered more than she understood. She placed the tray down carefully on a nearby table. Her hands felt slightly cold. For a second, she stood still. Then she took a step forward. The distance to the piano wasn't long, but it felt like crossing into a different world. With each step, the sounds of the room seemed to fade just a little. Conversations softened, laughter became distant, and the light around her felt warmer. Some guests watched with curiosity. Others didn't pay much attention, expecting nothing more than a simple attempt. She reached the piano and stood beside it. Up close, it looked even more beautiful. She gently pulled the bench and sat down. For a moment, she didn't touch the keys. Her hands rested in her lap as she looked down, taking a slow breath. The polished surface of the piano reflected the lights above, and for a brief second, she saw her own reflection. Felt strange. This wasn't her place. Or at least, that's what she had always believed. She could feel the eyes of the room on her now. Not all of them, but enough to remind her that she wasn't alone. Her fingers moved slightly, as if remembering something. Memories began to surface quietly. A small room, a much older piano, long hours of practice, mistakes, repeating the same piece again and again until it felt right. Those days felt far away. Life had changed. Things hadn't gone the way she once imagined. And slowly she had stopped playing. Not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Now, sitting here again, it all came back in a rush. Her hands trembled just a little as she lifted them and placed them gently on the keys. The first touch felt unfamiliar, cold, distant. She closed her eyes for a second. Just something simple, she reminded herself. That's all they expected. That's all she needed to do. A simple tune. Nothing more. She opened her eyes again and looked at the keys. Her fingers pressed down softly. The first note sounded. It was quiet, almost lost in the room. Then another note followed. And another. A slow, simple melody began to form. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't meant to be. It was just enough to fill the silence. Some guests continued talking, barely noticing. Others glanced over for a moment before returning to their conversations. It was exactly what everyone expected. Just background music. But inside her, something was starting to shift. Each note felt a little more familiar than the last. Her fingers moved slightly more confidently. The nervousness didn't disappear, but it changed. It became something else. Something deeper. She wasn't just pressing keys anymore. She was remembering. And without realizing it, she kept playing. The melody continued, soft and simple, just as everyone expected. It blended into the background like a quiet conversation no one was really listening to. A few people glanced toward the piano for a second, then turned back to their drinks and discussions. For them, it was nothing special, just a temporary solution to a small problem. But for her, it was something else entirely. Her fingers moved carefully over the keys, almost as if they were asking permission with every note. She stayed within the safe space of a basic tune, something she knew wouldn't draw too much attention. That's what she wanted, to stay unnoticed, to finish quickly, and return to her work like nothing had happened. Still, her heart was beating faster than usual. She could feel it in her chest, steady but strong, reminding her that this moment was real. Her shoulders were slightly tense, and every small movement felt bigger than it should. She kept her eyes mostly on the keys, avoiding the faces in the room. But even without looking, she could feel them. There were whispers now. Not loud, not rude, but present. Is she really playing? I think she works here. Well, at least it sounds okay. The words floated through the air, reaching her in pieces. They weren't meant to hurt, but they carried a certain weight. A quiet judgment. A low expectation. She swallowed lightly and kept going. The melody repeated, simple and steady. She focused on keeping it smooth, not missing a note, not making a mistake that would make people notice her for the wrong reason. Because that was her biggest fear. Not failing loudly, but failing in front of people who already didn't believe in her. Her fingers paused for a fraction of a second, almost unnoticeable. A small hesitation. Then she continued. She told herself again, just finish this. That's all she needed to do. But something inside her didn't feel ready to stop. As the tune moved forward, her hands began to relax slightly. The stiffness in her fingers faded just a little. The keys didn't feel as cold anymore. They felt familiar, almost welcoming. Surprised her. She hadn't expected that. For so long, the piano had been something distant, something she had left behind. It belonged to another time in her life. A time filled with effort, dreams, and quiet determination. A time she rarely allowed herself to think about. But now, sitting here, those memories weren't staying away. They were returning. Clearer. Stronger. She remembered the feeling of practicing late into the night, repeating the same notes until they sounded right. She remembered the frustration when things didn't go as planned, and the small moments of happiness when they finally did. She remembered how much it had meant to her. Her fingers slowed slightly, then picked up again. The simple tune was still there, but something about it was changing. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't really listening. But it was there. Her touch became softer in some places, stronger in others. The rhythm shifted just a little. Not enough to stand out, but enough to feel different. A guest sitting closer to the piano looked up for a moment, noticing the change. They tilted their heads slightly, as if trying to understand what was happening. Then they went back to their drink. The room was still filled with conversation, but it wasn't as loud as before. The music had started to take a small place in the background, not ignored but not fully noticed either. She took a slow breath. Her hands were moving more naturally now. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it wasn't controlling her the same way anymore. It had softened, making space for something else. Something quieter. Something stronger. Confidence. Not a bold, loud confidence, but a quiet one. The kind that grows slowly, step by step. Her fingers moved into a slightly different pattern. It wasn't part of the original simple tune. She didn't plan it. It just happened. For a second, she realized what she was doing and almost pulled back. Her hands hovered just slightly, unsure. Should she go back? Should she stay safe? But then she heard the sound. The note she had just played lingered in the air, soft but clear. Felt right. Without thinking too much, she continued. One note led to another, then another. The melody began to stretch, growing just a little beyond what it was before. It was still calm, still gentle, but it carried more feeling now. More depth. She could feel it in the way her fingers pressed the keys. She could hear it in the way the notes connected. A couple sitting near the center of the room slowly turned their heads toward the piano. They didn't speak. They just listened for a moment. Something had caught their attention. Not enough to stop everything, but enough to notice. She didn't see them. She was focused on the keys. But she felt something shifting in the room. The air felt different. Her breathing became steadier. The tension in her shoulders eased. She wasn't thinking about the guests anymore. She wasn't thinking about the host or the whispers or the expectations. She was just playing. And that changed everything. Her fingers moved more freely now, no longer asking for permission. The hesitation that was there before had faded, replaced by a quiet flow. It wasn't perfect. There were still small imperfections, tiny moments where her fingers didn't land exactly as she wanted. But it didn't matter, because the feeling was real, and that made it enough. A few more people began to notice, not because the music was loud or dramatic, but because it felt different from what they expected. It didn't sound like someone just filling time anymore. It sounded like someone remembering something important. The host, who had been busy speaking with a group of guests, paused for a moment. They glanced toward the piano, curious. Their expression changed slightly, just a small shift, but it was there. She continued playing, unaware of how many eyes were slowly turning toward her. Inside, something was opening, something she had kept closed for a long time. The music was no longer just a simple tune. It was becoming something else, something more, and she hadn't even realized how far she had already come from where she started. But there was still a part of her holding back, a quiet voice reminding her to stay careful, to not go too far, to not draw too much attention, because attention could bring questions, and questions could bring memories she wasn't ready to face. So she stayed in between, not fully stepping forward, but not going back either. Balanced, careful, but slowly that balance was starting to shift. Her fingers paused again for a brief moment, just 1 second, and in that second, everything felt still. Then she pressed the next note, and this time it carried more feeling than before, more weight, more truth, and without realizing it, she was no longer just playing for them. She was playing for herself. The room was no longer as loud as before. It didn't happen all at once. There was no sudden silence, no clear moment where everything stopped. Instead, the change came slowly, like a quiet wave moving through the space. Conversations softened. Laughter became less frequent. Even the sound of glasses touching seemed to fade into the background. The music had begun to take its place. She didn't notice it right away. Her focus was still on the piano, on the movement of her fingers, on the feeling of each note as it left her hands and filled the air. The simple tune she had started with was still there, but it had changed so much that it almost felt like something new. Her hands moved with more certainty now. The hesitation that once slowed her down was nearly gone. In its place was a steady rhythm, something natural and flowing. She didn't need to think about each note anymore. They came to her on their own, as if they had been waiting all this time to be played again. She let them come. Her fingers glided across the keys, moving from one section to another without pause. The melody grew deeper, richer, carrying more emotion with every passing moment. It was no longer just soft background music. It was something people could feel. A man standing near the back of the room slowly turned toward the piano. He had been checking his phone just moments ago, but now it rested forgotten in his hand. His eyes stayed fixed on her, as if trying to understand how something so simple had become so powerful. At another table, a group that had been laughing loudly grew quiet. One of them leaned slightly forward, listening more closely. No one said anything. There was no need. The music was speaking enough. She still hadn't looked up. Part of her didn't want to. Looking up would mean seeing the room, seeing the people, seeing their reactions. And that could break the moment. It could bring back the fear she had slowly pushed aside. So she stayed where she felt safe, within the music. Her breathing matched the rhythm now. Slow, steady, controlled. Each note felt connected to something inside her, something deeper than just memory. Felt like release. Her hands moved into a new section, one she hadn't planned. It wasn't part of the simple tune anymore. It wasn't even something she had practiced exactly the same way before. But it felt right. The notes rose gently, then fell, then rose again with more strength. There was a story in the way they moved, something quiet but clear. And for the first time she allowed herself to lean into it. Not fully, but enough. A woman sitting closer to the piano placed her glass down slowly, her attention completely drawn in now. Her expression softened, her eyes following the movement of the player's hands. She said she only knew a little. Someone whispered nearby. That doesn't sound like a little, another replied quietly. The whispers weren't mocking anymore. They were different now. Curious, surprised, even a little amazed. The host, who had once been worried about the missing pianist, now stood still, watching from across the room. The frustration from earlier had disappeared. In its place was something unexpected. Respect. She could feel it, even without looking. The air had changed. It wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't filled with doubt or quiet judgment. It was something else now. Something warmer. She took a deeper breath. Her fingers pressed the keys with more confidence. More purpose. The music grew slightly stronger, not louder in a harsh way, but fuller. It carried more presence, filling the space without forcing it. It demanded attention without asking for it. And people gave it willingly. More heads turned. More conversations stopped. The room was slowly becoming still. Inside her, something continued to shift. The part of her that had been holding back was weakening. That quiet voice telling her to stay small, to stay safe, was fading with every note she played. Because the truth was becoming clear. She wasn't small. She never had been. She had just been hidden. Her fingers moved faster now, but not in a rushed way. There was control in every movement, a balance between speed and precision. It was the kind of control that didn't come from thinking but from feeling, from knowing. The melody built slowly, layer by layer. Each section connected to the next, creating something larger than what it had been at the start. The simple tune had become a foundation, something she had stepped away from without even realizing it. Now she was somewhere else entirely. A place where the music led and she followed. A place she hadn't been in a long time. Her posture changed slightly as she played. She sat a little straighter, her shoulders more relaxed. There was a quiet strength in the way she held herself now. Confidence. Not the kind that needed to be seen, but the kind that could be felt. A man near the front leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the piano. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just listened, as if the music had pulled him into a different space. No one was eating anymore. No one was checking their phones. Even the staff had slowed down, some of them standing still for a moment longer than they should, watching quietly before returning to their tasks. It wasn't just a performance anymore. It was an experience, and she was at the center of it. Still, she hadn't fully let go. There was more inside her. More feeling. More strength. More music. But it was held back, just slightly, like a door that hadn't been fully opened yet. Her fingers softened again for a moment, bringing the melody down to something gentle. Calm pause within the flow. It gave the room a chance to breathe, a moment to take in what they were hearing. The silence between the notes felt just as important as the notes themselves. And in that quiet space, something powerful began to grow. She felt it. A pull. A quiet urge to go further. To stop holding back. Her hands hovered for the smallest moment, just above the keys. It was the same kind of pause she had felt earlier. A choice. Go back to safe. Or step forward into something unknown. Her heart beat a little faster. Not from fear this time, but from something else. Something stronger. She pressed the next note. And this time she didn't hold back. The moment she pressed that note, something changed completely. It was no longer careful. It was no longer controlled in the way it had been before. The music didn't hesitate anymore. It moved forward with confidence, with strength, with a kind of emotion that couldn't be hidden even if she tried. Her fingers didn't pause this time. They flowed. The melody rose higher, fuller, and deeper than anything she had played so far. It was still beautiful, still clear, but now it carried something stronger inside it. Something that reached beyond the room and touched something inside the people listening. She didn't think anymore. She didn't worry about mistakes. She didn't care who was watching, because in that moment, she wasn't playing for them. She was finally playing freely. The music began to build in layers. One line of notes followed another, weaving together into something rich and alive. Her left hand held a steady foundation, while her right hand moved with speed and grace, creating patterns that felt both powerful and emotional. It was no longer a simple tune. It had become something entirely different. Something that felt like a story being told without words. The room felt it instantly. A deep silence spread across the space, stronger than before. It wasn't just quiet, it was focused. Every person in the room was now aware of what was happening. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the smallest sounds had disappeared. All that remained was the music. A man near the back slowly lowered his glass, his eyes fixed on the piano. He didn't even realize he had stopped drinking. His attention was completely taken. At one of the tables, someone leaned forward with both hands resting on the edge, as if getting physically closer would help them understand what they were hearing. Another guest shook their head slightly, almost in disbelief. "This can't be the same person," they whispered. But it was, and she was only just beginning. Her fingers moved faster now, but every note was clear. There was no rush, no panic. It was controlled but not limited, strong but not forced. The music rose again, higher this time, carrying emotion that felt almost overwhelming. There was something in it that people could feel deeply, even if they couldn't explain it. It wasn't just skill. It was everything she had kept inside for so long. Every moment she had stayed silent. Every time she had stepped back instead of forward. Every dream she had pushed aside. It was all there in the way she played, and the room felt it. A woman near the center of the hall slowly placed her hand over her chest. Her eyes locked on the piano. There was a softness in her expression now. Something emotional. Something real. She wasn't the only one. Across the room, people who had come for a simple evening of food and conversation were now completely still, drawn into something they hadn't expected at all. Even the host stood frozen, their earlier frustration completely forgotten. They had asked for something simple, but what they were hearing now was anything but simple. It was something rare, something unforgettable. She leaned slightly into the piano, her posture more open now, more connected. Her shoulders moved naturally with the rhythm, her head tilting just slightly as she followed the flow of the music. She wasn't holding back anymore, not even a little. Her hands moved across the keys with a kind of freedom that only comes when someone stops being afraid. The notes came faster, then softer, then stronger again, creating a rhythm that felt alive. It was like breathing, like something natural and unstoppable. The melody shifted again, moving into a more intense section. The sound grew deeper, richer, filling every corner of the room. It wrapped around the listeners, pulling them in completely. A few people exchanged glances, but no one spoke. Words didn't feel right anymore. The music had taken over that space, and she was in control of it. But it didn't feel like control in a strict way. Felt like connection. Like she and the piano were no longer separate things. Her fingers weren't searching for notes anymore. They knew exactly where to go. Every movement had purpose. Every sound carried meaning. And the more she played, the more it grew. The energy in the room shifted again. It became heavier, but not in a bad way. It was full. Full of feeling, full of attention, full of something that people don't experience often. Something honest. A man sitting alone near the side slowly leaned back in his chair, his eyes slightly wide. He looked like he was seeing something he hadn't expected to see. Something real. Near the entrance, even a staff member who had been walking by stopped for a second longer than they should have, caught by the sound. No one wanted to miss it, because they could feel that something important was happening. Not loud, not dramatic in a showy way, but deep and true. Her fingers slowed for a brief moment, bringing the music down just enough to create space. A soft pause, like a breath before something bigger. The silence between the notes felt powerful. It made everyone lean in, even if they didn't realize they were doing it. And then she continued. Stronger, bolder. The next section came with more intensity, more emotion than anything before it. The notes moved quickly, but they didn't feel rushed. They felt deliberate, like each one had something to say. The melody climbed, rising higher and higher, building toward something. Something that hadn't arrived yet, but was coming, and everyone could feel it. She wasn't thinking about the end. She wasn't thinking about what came next. She was just inside the moment, fully present, fully connected. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like herself again. Not the quiet waitress moving unnoticed between tables, but something else. Someone who had something to give. Something that mattered. Her hands moved with even more strength now, pressing into the keys with confidence. The sound filled the room completely, leaving no space for anything else. And still she kept going, because now there was no reason to stop. The music kept rising, carrying the entire room with it. By now, no one was distracted anymore. Every single person in the hall was focused on the piano. Conversations had completely stopped. Even the soft background noises that once filled the space were gone. Felt like time itself had slowed down. Her hands moved quickly across the keys, but there was no panic in her movement. Everything was controlled, even in its intensity. The melody had grown into something powerful, something that felt bigger than the room itself. Each note seemed to reach out and hold onto the people listening. And they let it. She leaned slightly forward, her fingers pressing deeper into the keys now. The sound was fuller, stronger, filled with emotion that could not be ignored. It wasn't just music anymore. It was a moment, a shared experience that everyone in the room was now part of. Her breathing was steady, but her heart was racing. Not from fear, but from something else. Something alive. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. The music began to climb again, moving toward something higher, something more intense. It felt like it was building toward a peak, something just out of reach but getting closer with every second. The listeners felt it too. A man near the center of the room slowly straightened his posture, his eyes fixed, unblinking. A woman beside him clasped her hands together, as if holding on to the moment so it wouldn't slip away. Near the back, someone shook their head softly, almost smiling in disbelief. No one expected this. No one could have. She pressed a series of notes faster now, her fingers moving with incredible precision. There was no hesitation left in her. No doubt. No fear. Only the music. Only the feeling. It flowed through her completely. The melody turned sharper for a moment, then softened again, then rose even higher than before. It was like a wave, building and falling, pulling everyone deeper into it. Her shoulders moved slightly with the rhythm. Her posture was open, strong, confident. She wasn't hiding anymore. Not from the room. Not from herself. Her hands crossed briefly, then separated again, creating a sound that felt layered and rich. It filled every corner of the hall, leaving no empty space behind. People leaned forward in their seats. Some held their breath without realizing it. Others simply stared, unable to look away. The host stood still near the side. Their expression completely changed from the beginning of the night. There was no frustration now, no concern. Only quiet amazement. The music began to reach its highest point. It didn't rush there. It built carefully, step by step, each note adding more weight, more feeling, more meaning. And then, it arrived. The peak of the performance came like a powerful wave, strong and full, but not overwhelming. It was controlled, beautiful, and deeply emotional. Her fingers moved faster than ever now, but every note was clear, every sound intentional. It felt like everything she had held inside was being released in that moment. All at once, the room felt it. A deep, shared feeling passed through the audience. Something unspoken, something understood without words. A few people's eyes filled with quiet emotion. Others sat completely still, as if moving would break the moment. The music held them there. She didn't stop. Not yet. The intensity stayed strong for a few more seconds, holding the peak, letting it breathe. And then, slowly, she began to bring it down. Her fingers softened. The speed eased. The sound became gentler, calmer, but still full of meaning. It was like the final part of a story, where everything settles, where everything finds its place. The melody slowed, each note spaced carefully, giving the room time to feel it fully. No one moved. No one spoke. They stayed with her until the very end. Her hands moved slower now, almost floating over the keys. The final notes came gently, one after another, each one softer than the last. Felt like a quiet goodbye, a closing moment that didn't need anything more. And then, the last note. It lingered in the air, soft and clear. Then it faded. Silence. Complete silence. For a brief moment, no one reacted. It wasn't because they didn't care. It was because they couldn't. The moment was too full, too real to break immediately. She sat still at the piano, her hands resting lightly near the keys. Her breathing was calm again, but her heart still carried the energy of everything she had just played. She didn't look up right away. She didn't need to. She could feel the room. And then, it happened. A single clap, clear and strong, came from somewhere near the front. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire room erupted into applause. Loud, uncontrolled, real. People stood up from their seats. Some clapped harder than others, some smiled, some shook their heads in disbelief. But all of them shared the same feeling. Respect. She slowly lifted her head. For the first time since she started playing, she looked at the room. And what she saw surprised her. No one was ignoring her anymore. No one was whispering. No one was doubting. They were all looking at her. Truly looking. Not as a waitress. Not as background. But as someone who had just given them something unforgettable. The applause continued, filling the room with a new kind of energy. Warm. Genuine. She blinked softly, almost unsure if it was real. Her hands rested in her lap now, still slightly warm from the keys. For a second, she didn't move. She just sat there, taking it in. The sound, the faces, the moment. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel proud. The applause didn't fade quickly. It stayed, strong and steady, filling the room in a way that felt completely different from the music that had just ended. It wasn't quiet or controlled. It was loud, honest, and full of energy. People were still standing. Some were clapping with wide smiles, others with a kind of disbelief that hadn't left their faces yet. A few looked at each other as if to silently confirm that what they had just witnessed was real. She remained seated for a moment longer. Felt strange to move. Just seconds ago, she had been completely lost in the music, far away from everything else. Now, she was suddenly back in the room, surrounded by people, surrounded by attention, something she had spent so long avoiding. Her hands rested gently in her lap, still carrying a faint warmth from the keys. Her breathing had slowed, but inside, everything still felt alive. She slowly stood up. The applause grew even louder. Surprised her. She wasn't used to this. Not anymore. She gave a small, unsure nod, not quite knowing how to respond. It wasn't a practiced gesture. It was natural, simple, real. A quiet way of saying thank you. The host was the first to move toward her. There was no hesitation this time. Their expression was completely different from earlier in the night. The stress, the frustration, the worry, it had all disappeared. In its place was something genuine. "You said you only played a little," they said, their voice filled with a mix of amazement and disbelief. She gave a small, almost shy smile. "I haven't played in a long time," she replied honestly. It wasn't an excuse. It was the truth. The host shook their head slightly, still trying to process everything. "That was more than anything we planned for tonight." Before she could respond, others began to gather around. Guests who had once been busy with their own conversations were now stepping closer, drawn by curiosity and admiration. They didn't rush or crowd her, but there was a quiet pull that brought them in. A woman from earlier, the one who had been sitting close to the piano, spoke softly. "That didn't feel like just music," she said. "It felt like something deeper." She didn't know how to answer that, because the woman was right. It had been something deeper, but explaining it felt impossible. So she simply nodded. Another guest asked, "Where did you learn to play like that?" The question lingered. For a moment, she looked down slightly, as if searching for the right words. "I used to practice a lot," she said after a pause. "A long time ago." There was more to the story. There always was. But she didn't feel the need to share everything. Not here. Not now. The group around her listened quietly. No one pushed further. There was a sense of respect in the way they stood, in the way they spoke to her. It wasn't loud or overwhelming. It was calm, real. Among the guests, one person stood a little apart, watching more closely than the others. They hadn't said anything yet, but their attention hadn't shifted away from her since the performance ended. After a moment, they stepped forward. "You didn't just play," they said in a steady voice. "You told a story." She looked up at them, slightly surprised by the words. They weren't said casually. They were said with understanding. And that made them feel different. "I guess I did," she replied softly. The person nodded, as if they had expected that answer. "There's something very rare in what you did tonight," they continued. "Not just skill. Something real." She didn't know their name. She didn't know who they were. But the way they spoke made her listen. "You shouldn't leave that behind again," they added. The words stayed with her. For a second, everything around her seemed to quiet down again, even though the room was still full of people. Because those words touched something deeper. Something she had tried to ignore for a long time. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let the moment settle. The person didn't push further. They simply gave a small nod and stepped back, allowing space again. The crowd around her slowly began to spread out, returning to their tables, but the energy in the room had changed completely. The conversations that started again were different now. Softer, more thoughtful. Every now and then, someone would glance toward her, as if still thinking about what they had just heard. She stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. And then reality gently returned. The trays, the tables, the work she had left behind. It all came back. She was still part of the staff. Still expected to continue the night like nothing had changed. But something had changed. Inside her. She walked back toward her station slowly. Not rushed, not hidden. Different. A few of her coworkers looked at her with quiet surprise. One of them gave a small smile. Another nodded in a way that said more than words. No one made a big scene. But the respect was there. She picked up a tray again. The same tray she had been holding earlier. But it didn't feel the same in her hands anymore. As she moved through the room, she noticed small things she hadn't noticed before. The way people looked at her now. Not with indifference, but with awareness. A couple of guests thanked her more warmly when she served them. One even said, "That was beautiful," in a soft voice as she placed a glass on the table. She nodded, still adjusting to it. Still processing. The night continued, but it felt lighter somehow. Not because the work had changed, but because she had. Later, when the event slowly came to an end and the guests began to leave, the room grew quieter again. Chairs were pushed back. Lights felt softer. The grand piano remained in its place, silent once more. She glanced at it one last time. It didn't feel distant anymore. It felt familiar, like something she didn't have to walk away from again. She took a slow breath. For so long, she had believed that part of her life was over, that it belonged to the past, something she had lost. But tonight had shown her something different. It hadn't been lost. It had just been waiting for a moment, waiting for a chance. And somehow that chance had come in the most unexpected way. A simple request, a simple tune. She let out a small, quiet breath, almost like a release. Then she turned and continued with her work. But this time, she didn't feel invisible anymore.